Thank you for the participating to this panel. As Emma already told about the details, today we are going to have two presenters whose topics are very great to read and to be listened. And we are going to start with the Luigi Leonardo. He's a lecturer in University College Cork. He's teaching the European Union law, international law, and also French constitutional law. And now he's also a visiting lecturer in Sciences Po Paris. And he's also teaching there in the European Security and Defense Policy. His main research interests are mainly the European Union law and external relations. Am I correct? And particularly you are interested in and you are focusing on the security and the defense part of the European Union. And then we are going to listen to the Ahmet Tüzgen. Ahmet is the second-year PhD researcher at University of Southampton Politics, and he received in bachelor's and master's degree in Istanbul University in International Relations and Politics. And his main research areas is about the European security and the European Union-China relations, human security. And he is now currently writing his thesis on the consistency and coherency on the European Union's decisions on China. And I think he is going to present his research today. And if we are okay, all right, and we can start with Luigi to listen to your paper. Yeah.
Thank you, Filiz. Thank you for giving me the chance to present my research today. What I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so is a chapter, or the draft chapter in a forthcoming monograph. This is work in progress, and what I'm going to say is going to be in tentative terms. So I hope to stimulate your curiosity, and I very much look forward to our discussion, comments, and really ways to improve. I have a lot of questions, in fact, about this. So first, what do I mean by the silence of foreign policy? My question is really a deceptive, no, it's a counterintuitive one. It's why did the EU not act in its foreign policy when it could have, or when it might have reasonably be expected that it might have acted? So the question is a counterintuitive one, is a strange one, because I'm trying to explain why something did not happen. So to be clear, I'm not just asking why something not happen like randomly. I'm asking why something that we were supposed to see did not happen, why something that should have happened did not happen. Okay. Now, what I would like to do in the presentation today is just to look a bit at the theory, which I find extremely interesting, on explanations of non-event, explanation of inaction. And then the chapter distinguishes two kinds of inaction. One is the decision not to act, and the other is the failure to act proper. And then I will focus in this part 3, failure to act, on quite topical, sadly, event that is why did the EU not act in Ukraine, or in Eastern Ukraine, in 2014? And that's where it gets very tentative, and that's where I will want to get your feedback in particular, as well as on anything else. Okay, so if we consider a bit the theory, there are obvious methodological difficulties in explaining a non-event. First, because we need to identify what is the non-event, what is the thing that did not happen, which we are trying to explain. Now, we need to find something that did not happen, but that was supposed to happen, that we reasonably expected to happen. So there are, for example, in the literature, authors who try to explain foreign policy failures. But by foreign policy failures, Baldwin, for example, writes about measures of success. So it explains what counts as a good foreign policy decision or what counts as a bad foreign policy decision. So it's not about failure to act, but what this frameworks suggest is that actors, states, institutions, leaders act rationally to maximize their welfare. And therefore, since they act rationally and they calculate what is the best possible choice, sometimes rationality demands that they choose not to act. So first take home point, in some cases it is rational not to act. In this case, we explain a non-event by a positive event. So we explain that something did not happen because somebody chose not to act. So there is a deliberate choice not to do something. This is one possible kind of explanation. I think other kinds of explanations are more complicated. We could say that inaction is the result of somebody else's choice. So we could say that there were actors who prevented, for example, by manipulating the political agenda, manipulating information, exercising some form of power, prevented somebody else from acting. So we have here inaction as a result of somebody else's deliberate choices. So in both cases, either it's your choice or it's somebody else's choice, we explain inaction by reference to some previous choice. So we find an event which explains a non-event. And I am fine with that. I think it's methodologically sound. More complicated is when we make reference to structural constraints. And we say, for example, the EU did not act because there is because there is unanimity rule in common foreign and security policy, so there could not be agreement. Okay, that is the invocation of a structural legal constraint. I am not sure that that counts as an explanation because it is a just so story. In other words, it tries to say that something could have happened. It tries to explain a non-event by saying that it could have happened, it could have also not happened because that was the rule of the game. I don't find that particularly convincing. So what I'm trying to look at in the chapter is to consider whether somebody else acted, for example, and whether the fact that somebody else acted explains residually as a byproduct why the European Union did not act. Now, going back to earth, to something more concrete, examples of decision not to act can be explained, I think, simply by a form of rational choice theory. In other words, the hypothesis is if institutions act rationally, it is expected that sometimes they will refrain from acting when it best serves their interests to do so. Now, rational choice theorists discuss what is the meaning of the word best, but we don't need to consider that for the purposes of this presentation. An example, I think, could be the inaction of the EU in part of the Indo-Pacific region. Consider in particular the little EU presence in India and Southeast Asia as compared to other areas of the Indo-Pacific, for example, the Gulf of Aden with Common Security and Defense Policy mission. Can we explain that? Perhaps we can. So it's true that that there are member states with significant interests in the area. For example, I put here in the picture the French Empire extended to Southeast Asia, but it is true that in some, the European Union as such does not have significant interests, significant security and defense interests in Southeast Asia. They are indirect, if at all, and therefore the EU does not do much more than produce strategic documents, essentially. They are not operationalized. There are no CSDP missions in the area. Now, that is perhaps trivially true. What is what is really interesting for me is to consider case studies where the EU was supposed to act, but it could not. It was prevented from doing so. The cases of, strictly speaking, failure to act. Now, in the chapter, I consider two of them. I consider the failure to launch a CSDP mission in Libya in 2011, and I consider the failure to launch a CSDP mission or to act as mediator in the Donbas region or in Ukraine generally in 2014. Now, I cannot explain more precisely what it is that the European Union should have done because it did not do it. I'm trying to explain though why it was within the Normandy format that which you see in the picture, that the actors involved in the peace process were brought to a table and not through the European Union, for example. I think that is a fair question. So what happened, I have like a microscopic timeline of events with which we are probably all familiar by now. In February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament decided to essentially remove Yanukovych, who was the president of the Ukraine at the time. 2 weeks later, Russia controlled militarily Crimea, which was later annexed with a popular referendum, and in April, Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence, which would be then recognized only a few years later. The EU did act. It did act in March. It acted in May and in July by adopting restrictive measures. So 3 rounds of sanctions were adopted by the EU. So the first objection that I expect you would move to me is, but the EU did do something. It adopted 3 packages, as they now call them, of restrictive measures. Okay, that's fair enough. But what the EU not do is what I wrote in the slides. There was no mediation led by or with the participation of the European Union. And there was no common security and defense policy mission. Now, there is scholarship on why the European Union did not act on that occasion. There are authors who cite structural constraints, as I mentioned, the fact that there is unanimity in the Council in order to authorize restrictive measures. That's fair enough, even though there is also unanimity for imposition of sanctions. There are authors who cite a difference in beliefs between member states, the difference in particular between the fear of Central and Eastern European states in the assessment of the threat that Russia posed. So you had the Baltic states that were strongly in favor of taking action, and Central European states such as Slovakia and Hungary that were more cautious, to use a euphemism. They were more they were closer to Russia's position. And there are also authors who cite another structural constraint, which is the long-term dependence on Russia, which we are all aware, the energy dependence, to name but one. So how do I suggest to explain the failure to act, for example, in the mediating process, is by saying it is because there was already the Normandy format. So the Normandy format is when Putin and Yanukovych and France and Germany, France and Germany negotiated with Russia, Ukraine, and then the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk for the European Union, as if it was a form of delegation from the European Union to the 2 member states who took the lead. That perhaps explains why the European Union did not act, because somebody else because somebody else did. Now, I don't know if that is in any way a satisfactory explanation. And even more than that, it's even more tentative. I'm still not sure that Ukraine 2014 is a good case study for that. But having said this, what I would say is that, to conclude, inaction may be explained either by the deliberate choice to refrain from acting, which is predicted by rational choice theory. Really, most member states lack political priorities or strategic interest in a specific region. That can be the case of Indochina, or it can be explained residually, meaning that a byproduct of the explanation for somebody else's action. So the Normandy format in the case of Ukraine allowed member states to mediate in the Ukrainian conflict, because we remember that it resulted, this mediation, into the first Minsk agreement, so the first real ceasefire in 2015, and they did so because that Normandy format was more efficient than the cumbersome procedure of common foreign and security policy making. So this concludes my presentation. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for your presentation, Luigi. Thank you for your participation also in your very busy area. And if it's okay for you, we can go to continue with Ahmet. Ahmet, he's going to present his research on the European Union and China relations, as far as I understand. Let's give the word to Ahmet. Yeah.
Thank you again for organizing this beautiful event. And I'm glad that Luigi started first, because I think our topics are really interrelated. As you mentioned, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Southampton, and I am currently researching on the EU's foreign policy on China. And when I examine the recent decisions, I think there were some apparent inconsistencies, such as 3 months after concluding a comprehensive investment deal, the Council decided to impose sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 1 political body. And of course, China responded with counter-sanctions. And normally you don't expect an international actor to take a decision that would damage cooperation right after signing an investment deal. That's why I started investigating the reasons for the inconsistency of the EU's policy towards China. And today I will briefly present not the whole thesis, but a draft of my theoretical framework chapter. And it is also still in progress. And I would be grateful if you have any comments on how to improve it. My presentation also has 3 parts. Firstly, I will explain the concept of consistency and what kind of inconsistencies are there in the recent decisions. After that, I will mention what do EU theories say about consistency and what can especially Europeanization offer us for the inconsistent decisions. And lastly, I will discuss how can I use these theories to make sense of inconsistent decisions on China. So the first section is concept of consistency. It is defined as the state or condition of always happening or behaving in the same way, or harmony of parts to one another or a whole. And in terms of the EU's external activities, it is described as coordinated and coherent behavior based on agreement among the Union and its member states to not to pursue uncontradictory foreign policies. And while there are some critical perspectives that suggest consistency may not result in an effective foreign policy, the mainstream view in this field is that consistency in foreign policy is desirable, since it increases the ability and therefore the credibility and the ability of the EU to pursue its interests and values on international stage. Because of this, the Union frequently underlines the need for consistency or coherency in its policies. It is first appeared in an official EU document in 1974, and afterward many key EU treaties and texts mentioned consistency. And it became even more significant with the polarization. The number of studies in this field rose rapidly after the treaties in the 1990s. The main reason for this is the expansion of cross-pillar activities and the increase of overlapping competencies between the pillars, particularly the rising external actorness of the Commission with its financial instruments such as TACES or European Neighborhood Policy led to more complexity of interpillar relations and also increased the need for harmonization between different policy fields and between institutions such as Commission and Council Secretariat. After that time, also the need for consistency between policies of member states and the EU increased. These two aspects of consistency are the most researched areas of consistency. The former is called horizontal or interinstitutional consistency. The latter is called vertical consistency. So if we get back to the subject of the study, we can see both types of inconsistencies in the recent policies and decisions. For example, as I mentioned, there is trade deals and sanction deals, and after years of avoiding conceptualizing the nature of the relationship with China, in 2019, the EU described China in the EU's China Strategic Outlook as a systemic rival, alongside as a competitor and a partner. Although this description points to the multifaceted relationship between them, we can see that some member states or institutions have been more active in some aspects of the relationship. I mean, while the outlook underlined the security challenges that China poses with its increasing military capabilities, we see that some member states pushed more for the conclusion of the CAI deal, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, and these member states were generally the powerful or big member states. And during this process, the Commission was mainly responsible for maintaining the negotiations and preparing the deal. And on the other hand, 3 months later, the Council took the decisions to impose sanctions under the EU Global Human Rights Sanction Regime. The Parliament also criticized heavily the human rights violation in Xinjiang, and we can say that the MEPs were the principal responsible for the decisions of sanctions. That's why if we consider security concerns and cooperation, as well as investment agreements and imposing sanctions contradict each other, we can say that both vertical and horizontal consistency seems to lack in the recent policies. Then we should ask that how can we approach this issue? Why did the EU consider China as a threat, but at the same time promoted cooperation, then damaged this by sanctioning Chinese officials? What do EU theories say in order to explain the reasons for the inconsistency? This takes us to the second section of my presentation. EU integration theories provide different explanation to our questions. For instance, liberal intergovernmentalism argues that economic interests drive governments to cooperate, and what really matters in the EU's decisions are the member states' interests. I think this perspective allows making an inference about the decisions on China. On the other hand, supranationalist theory argues that institutions such as Parliament and Commission can take decisions that even governments of the most powerful states do not want to be taken. This also provides an important explanation. However, I believe both of these theories focus mostly on one dimension of the issue, and they may tend to ignore each other's perspectives. But as you can see in the recent decisions, both member states and supranational institutions have an influence on the decisions. For this reason, to offer a comprehensive explanation of the inconsistencies in the China case, I think we need to combine these two perspectives, and we need to look at both member state preferences and the EU institutions' policies. In this context, I suggest Europeanization's perspective provides a useful framework. The concept refers to the process of domestic policy areas becoming increasingly subject to European policy making, and vice versa, the process of European policy areas becoming increasingly subject to domestic policy making. Many Europeanization studies state that this process has bottom-up, top-down, and ideational aspects. The bottom-up aspect, which is also called uploading, is the influence of member states at the EU level, and top-down or downloading is the influence of institutions to the state level, and ideational aspect, which is also called cross-loading, is the exchange of norms and ideas between states and institutions. Therefore, this approach suggests that all these relations between member states and institutions and norms have a certain impact on European policies. And to narrow the scope of my research, I tried to select the most influential actors in the China case. And most Europeanization studies emphasize the powerful member states' capacity in uploading their preferences to the EU level. And we can see that, as I mentioned, during the negotiations of investment deal, big member states like Germany and France pushed for concluding the deal. That's why I believe my framework should include the policies and initiatives of the big member states. And since the efforts for cooperation seems inconsistent with the sanctions, I think that I should examine why the EU took sanction decisions or described China as a rival. The sanctions were based on the violations of human rights. Therefore, the role of the EU's identity or institutional culture, particularly the parliament stance, is crucial here. And lastly, I concentrate on how I can use this approach or theory for the EU's inconsistent policies and decisions. And we have already acknowledged that in cooperation with China, the powerful member states played a bigger role alongside the Commission. That's why questioning the member states' policies are, I think, very important for this research. On the other hand, European Parliament is one of the most questioning institutions of the EU's China policy, and its motivation seems apparently closely tied to the human rights or generally the EU values. And the MEPs frequently blame Beijing due to human rights violations towards not only the Uyghur minority, but also towards Hong Kong or Tibet. And being a co-decision maker in areas with the Council, in these areas, leads the Parliament's approval in the decision-making mechanism. So I can summarize my framework like this. If we agree that big member states and institutional values have an impact on the recent decisions, then I should try to assess their roles in the decisions. To do this, I think my empirical chapters of the thesis, which I am currently planning 3 cases for now, namely security, investment, and human rights. I think I should focus firstly on big member states, long-term stances towards these cases and their discourse and initiatives towards China, and do the same for the institutions. And I think this will help us to develop an understanding for the inconsistent decisions on China. To make a model about when the EU might take inconsistent or incoherent decisions, I think we should include both member states' preferences and capacity, as well as the identity and values of the institutions. I think we may suggest that when these two variables are coherent with each other, it is not unreasonable to expect consistent decisions in that policy field. Although there are some decisions that were taken with the initiatives of small or medium member states, they usually have limited capacity to upload their preferences to the EU level. Therefore, we can expect that the EU still might take consistent decisions when the priorities of small member states are incompatible. However, it's not the case when a powerful member state's preferences contradicts with the EU values or identity. I think I can summarize the perspective of the research like this. But as I said, this is a study that is still in progress. I may encounter a different result when I finish examining my case studies. So to wrap it up, I can say that there are seemingly inconsistent decisions toward China, both vertically and horizontally, and this damages the efficiency of the EU policies. And as we can see from the contradictory decisions within a short time, the EU's not monolithic, just as the member states are not. Different actors may pursue different kinds of policies, and this may represent one of the reasons for the inconsistency. And to understand the reasons for the inconsistency, we need to probably expand our perspective and examine different actors and different levels, as well as the identity, values, and maybe institutional culture. This would help us to develop a better understanding of the EU policies. And finally, I think Europeanization's perspective can offer us valuable insights. Looking into both member states' behavior and the institutions may help us to develop a comprehensive model for the inconsistent decisions. My presentation ends here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ahmet, for your good and insightful presentation. Thank you so much for your work. And if it's possible, and we can leave the chair to our discussant, Dr. Barış Çelik in Surrey University. And let's talk about your papers. Let's give the board to the Barış.
Thank you, Filiz, and thanks, Luigi and Ahmet, for very interesting, very thought-provoking papers. So, just to give some general comments on both of the papers to begin with, I think when we look at the European Union as a foreign policy actor, focusing on particular concepts and particular ways of doing things is I think very, very useful. Luigi looked at inaction and Ahmet looked at inconsistency. And I think when we focus on what the European Union does and what these kind of actions generate is a very useful way to analyze the European Union, because it also, I think, sort of mitigates this tension between what the EU is and what the EU does. Because when we look at inaction, then we can talk about whether the European Union's inability to act is something that is natural for the EU because of it being a multi-dimensional, non-state actor. And similarly, when we look at inconsistency, we can also say that is it something very natural for the European Union to demonstrate certain inconsistencies simply because it is formed of various actors with their own interests. So I really like the way in which you sort of unpacked the questions that you're looking at by focusing on particular words. But there are also, I think, some ways to connect the two papers and also to reflect upon them more critically. So first of all, I think in Luigi's paper, which was very interesting, maybe I think a way to add something more into the paper would be how to decide when the EU is inactive and when the EU is active. And Luigi, I think, himself alluded to the difficulty of doing so because the European Union is a very complex sector. Sometimes we say the EU is being inactive, but actually it has its own ways of doing things, and which can be unconventional, which can be weak, or sometimes, as Ahmet said, inconsistent. But EU sometimes acts, it's very, very rarely, just stands on the sideline and does nothing. Sometimes it just makes a simple declaration, and sometimes it makes more substantive action, as Luigi also mentioned in his paper. Atalanta operation off the Somali coast is one of the flagship successes of CSDP, a very long time operation, far away from Europe, but had achieved a lot of things. And sometimes it's just a declaratory output. So I was just wondering if we can set a threshold for the European Union's inaction. And this is very tricky for counterfactuals because we're talking about things that could have happened, but didn't happen. I read a book about the counterfactual exercises based on the theories explaining the First World War, and the question was, what would have happened if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been killed? Would we still have the First World War? But that's a useful train of thought there, because it makes it possible for us to understand the significance of the events. So I think if you can, Luigi, if you can, maybe add a few more lines in the paper about the threshold for inaction, then this will perhaps draw us closer to the significance of the things that have happened. Because we talk about things that haven't happened in counterfactuals, but if we can show the importance of what happened because it generated the outcome that we're looking at, then I think this can answer a very important question: what particular elements do we need for the EU to act, and what happens when that particular element is lacking, namely inaction. So again, just to sum up this bit, I think threshold for inaction is something that will be useful to look into a little bit more. And in terms of the paper by Ahmet, again, a very thought-provoking and insightful paper there. And I think it's very creative because I have never seen an application of Europeanization to look at the inconsistencies demonstrated by the European Union, because it's a theory that is always linked with the theories of integration. So the overarching research question is basically when member states pool and share and cooperate. But one of the values of Europeanization is that it goes beyond the relationships between member states or between member states and the European Union, but also looking at the whole set of relationships. So first of all, we have bottom-up and top-down approaches, but over time, Europeanization, has been further improved by adding the cross-loading perspective, as you also recognize in the paper, Ahmet. So in one of the chapters, I think you talk a little bit about quite extensively actually, about the theories of integration. But I was struggling to find, how this is linked to the problem of inconsistency. And perhaps it's an important element, because theories of integration essentially seek to answer, again, why member states pool and share their resources, why they cooperate in the form of the European Union. And I think this answers a very important question for your paper, which is, is inconsistency a result of lack of integration? But what about the factors that are beyond integration? So I think you can really keep that part in your paper. But in addition to that, and I have annotated some other comments, and I'll be happy to send them to you after the event. But I think in addition to integration theories, you can talk a little bit more about why member states fail to act consistently, or why the European Union doesn't act consistently. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a formal theory. I think like Europeanization or liberal intergovernmentalism, there are multiple ways of approaching this. You can find a lot of ways to complement that very useful part of your paper. But again, I think you have a very creative way of approaching this, which is using Europeanization. And I quite like also the way in which you broke down the different stages of decision-making process, because perhaps there is some consistency at the beginning, but the implementation of the decision may result in more inconsistencies over time. And I think two key things that I picked up is, first, as I said, perhaps complementing that review part of your paper by looking things that are beyond integration theories, and looking at other explanations, other theoretical explanations, if not necessarily formal theoretical explanations of why the EU acts inconsistently. And I will be happy also to share with you my recent paper on the EU's climate diplomacy, where I looked at inconsistencies in that particular area. But again, in that paper, I didn't look at the integration theory. So perhaps, I can complement that analysis with that part as well that you introduced. And secondly, how can we really use Europeanization in an analysis of inconsistency? And I think you have a very strong basis there for elaborating this in more detail. And again, I don't think this has been done extensively before. So there's quite a lot of creativity there. So I really enjoyed the papers. EU foreign policy is something that both me and Filiz have worked in the last few years, and I really enjoy talking about it too. And in the recent few months, I've been looking at particular concepts, inaction, inconsistency, and some other concepts, and whether they could be more useful for us to make inferences about European Union foreign policy, because I think being less generalistic sometimes can be more insightful, especially when we're talking about an actor that is very complex like the European Union. So thanks very much for the presentations, and I'll be happy to send my comments after the event.
Thank you, Barış, for your insightful comments and feedbacks. I think Luigi must leave due to his schedule. No? Oh, sorry.
I can
Lucia
leave if you
Frigo.
want,
Sorry. I totally read
No,
different person. If it's possible, I would like to also give some feedbacks to two of your papers. I really enjoyed reading this because it's, as Barış also told, that it's also related to our topic, which are also looking for the foreign and security policy of the European Union. And that's why, first of all, I read your paper, Luigi, because two of my case studies, which one of them is the Libya, the another one is the 2014 in the Ukraine. And I found it very useful to get to remind myself in terms of the new information. And first of all, I love to read this because it gives you the, you said, you mentioned about the inaction would be the deliberate choice of an actor, of deliberate choice of the another actors, of the result of unintended consequences of the action related to other stuff. The thing is that, first of all, I would like to say, as far as I see from the paper, it needs to be so much proved why you choose the Libya and the Ukraine, and why you are choosing the Venezuela and the Latin American countries and Venezuela for inaction, and for the failure to act, why you choose Libya and the Ukraine. It needs to be much more proof in terms of why these are so distinct and different to the rest of. And secondly, I'm looking for the paper because I got the notes to your paper, and you have been talking about the methodological differences, but I think it needs to be much more explained to, you know, the make the reader to get, oh yes, that's why you say. I'm talking about, I'm looking in a reader's perspective. And also, I would like to say about your the 2 case studies in the failure to act to the Libya and the Ukraine. And starting with the failure to act, this part should be much more strengthened, I guess, because I'm terribly sorry, might be because of my reading style. I cannot easily get, because you started with the Arab uprising and then go to the Libya. And I just a little bit confused about what is the relationship between the failure to act, why we are going to do this. It needs somehow much more proof for references for the Libya. And also in the Libya, you told about the there is no how can I say, CSTP operations, but there has been some small scale operations, for Libya and in UBAM Libya. You mentioned only the UBAM Libya later. Maybe you might mention that, although there are some 2 small scale missions, but these are not so enough to, you know, to prove yourself. And also for Libya and the Ukraine cases, there are some other stuff rather than, you know, failure to act. As Barış already told, and also the Ahmet told, European Union is not a monolithic actor. That's why in Libya, Germany's and the French internal political environment should be taken care of in terms of action or inaction or failure to act. I mean, failure to act I'm talking about. Maybe you could also add this. You also mentioned about the Koenig's, you know, the horizontal coherence, vertical coherence. Maybe you can mention about this, the horizontal coherence, what is the horizontal coherence and the vertical coherence, and then you can make this Libya connection, because I know the Koenig, but the reader may not have this kind of information. And for the Ukraine, I know it's very complicated, still complicated for me, even in the 2014. And sometimes I'm also losing myself in some cases. You need to be, you were very good about explaining the Ukraine situation and the Libya, why it happened, why the European Union came to this point and act in a different way. I think, in my personal opinion, in Ukraine, European Union acted much more convenient and much more together than it used to be in Libya, which should be the also good point. And also you mentioned the special issue, and which I read for the Ukraine. You mentioned about the acting together in Ukraine belonging to the, you know, the fear of Russia threats. But as far as I see from the special issue, I remember to especially there are some other reasons, not only the seeing the Ukraine as only one threat, because of we see the, you know, the rise of the Germany in terms of acting more passionately in Ukraine. Maybe you can act that if you would like to, you know, to make it rich your paper. I think these are my comments, and if you want, I will also send my comments to you later, the session finished. But I do really enjoy, because I haven't seen such, you know, the differentiation, inaction, failure to act, and also looking at the rationalist understanding. And for Ahmet, I really enjoyed your theoretical paper. As Barış said, it's very creative, because we can always omit the Europeanization in the European Union integration theories. We have always found, you know, the grand theory to, you know, the pro-war research problems and etc. One thing I would like to say is that I'm going to some critics, sorry, but I haven't seen the proper research, main research question. Although you have been dealing the stuff, you have, you know, the making the sense that yes, I'm going to do this. Maybe you can, you know, assert much more your research question and why you are going to do this. And secondly, you have been mentioned about the European Union theories, but these are the European Union integration theories. And in the meantime, you have been mentioned about some, the identity, culture, and etc. Maybe you can also talk about the constructivism, because you have also told the Europeanization, but in some cases regarding to the explanation of Europeanization in your paper, I see some cases, some constructivist elements. Maybe you can say, maybe you can differentiate why you are not going to use the constructivism in your research problem, and which I love the most in your theoretical framework, in your tables, and also the way that you have been using for operationalization of the theory. Please keep it that. It's going to be very interesting and very creative. I'm looking for the results of this. And another thing is, you have been mentioned about so much details about the budget structure, and as far as I see let me have a look at just a second, the Europeanization structure. You don't need to, to give all kinds of information, because it also blurs the readers. What you are going to do, you need to be, again, I'm repeating myself, but assertive to what you are going to do, what you would like to achieve, what you are expecting as a terms of, in terms of results. And for the two papers, I would like to say these are so great, so cool. In the meantime, once you would like to send this kind of papers, please be careful about the abbreviations. For the first time, if you would like to use the abbreviations, please write the longest name, which I know, which Barış know, but maybe can read it now. Also the footnotes and the references. And for Ahmet, if you would like to make me give my comments, I will also send you the details in order not to crash the session. Okay, one of the questions is coming to the Keiko Ferhat, to Ahmet, and she or he, I'm terribly sorry, he or she says that, asks that, sorry, could it be said that inconsistency is also coming from outside influence, like European Union's reaction to Trump administration? His go-along policy and the European Union's reaction to protect its value of taking multilateral approach via AAGO, or cope with the China's learning curve?
Thank you, Filiz. Also, thank you, Barış. I think your comments are very valuable, and I will probably definitely keep that in my mind while I'm revising my chapter. And I think Keiko's question is a good question. I believe the outside factors have substantial influence on the EU's decisions and policies. There are not only the member state level or the EU level, but there are also subnational or global factors that affect the decisions. We cannot simply separate the EU policy, especially on security or Chinese expansionism, from global developments such as the rising US-China tension. That's why I am planning to engage them in my topic as much as I can, but main focus, my main focus, I think, still will be on the EU and state level. But again, I think that's also very important. And I think constructivist perspective is also very important, as you, Filiz, you mentioned. Actually, I was planning to mention that, but I think that would excess my time for presentation. I agree that I should be more assertive. Some parts of the presentation sound like a lit review. I will try to revise the chapter according to these comments. Thank you.
Oh yeah, Daya would like to ask one question for both of you. Could you please share about the data sources you used or plan to use your studies?
Perhaps I can go ahead to thank you, Marish and Filiz, for the comments. They were very helpful and really provide a very useful blueprint of the changes that I need to make. So it's very much appreciated. And in terms of that, in fact, that also ties in with one of your comments. The data that I use in the study. It's a question of really how to select from the vast field of the EU action activities, even just presence. The book itself focuses on the post Lisbon 2009 till whatever. So perhaps that also starts answering why I have selected those case studies in particular. I thought they were the most outstanding, the most prominent, the clearest examples that I could think of, at least Libya and Ukraine. But if you have other other possible candidates, by all means. However, I entirely agree with everything that you said, and of course I will need to justify a bit more. And if I can take advantage of the fact that I'm already speaking, can I also ask a question to Ahmed, or rather move do a comment on that? I think that your thesis will rely, basically the case studies will make or break it, because there is so much on consistency itself that some external examiner could then criticize you for having too broad an umbrella under which you would need to fit so many things, that the case studies instead will help narrow down a bit the actual claim. In other words, from the presentation, I haven't read your paper, but from the presentation, I get the sense that you are that you might be better off focusing on something narrower, and that you might do that in the case studies. So I think that the case studies will be perhaps the most important part.
Yeah, I totally agree, Luigi. Thank you for that comment. And on the question about the data sources, I am planning to do interviews with the EU officials. Actually, I did a field trip last November and December, and I am planning to go to a second field trip to complete my interviews. I think that will be the main data source of my thesis, but also I am planning to use a triangular data method alongside with the interviews, the primary and secondary sources, discourses, that kind of stuff.
Maybe you could also mention about in your theoretical framework how you are going to, use this triangulation methods. Maybe it should be also in the theoretical framework. Since you are in the beginning, I cannot push you so hard to to do this and do that, because it's a way to learn the process. Thank you for also Luigi, your comments. Unfortunately, I mean, I know these case studies are exactly the topic that you are going to look for, but sometimes this needs to be the proof, and they can say that some of them can also find, as far as I remember from the European Union practitioners I told, some of them found that Libya is not the failure to act. I know they might be somehow optimistic, but they think about the fact that the European Union External Service and also the CSDP in the beginning, once the Libya exploded, and that's why they take Libya as a lessons learned, to go further. And after that, we improve some of our services, they told me. And that's why I'm telling you, it needs to be somehow the proof that why you see as an example of the failure to act. Because in your beginning introductory paragraphs seems just a little bit weak to, to go further. I'm also talking about for the two papers to the connection to the paragraphs. Somehow you can easily, to distract yourselves. I'm sorry to talk so much, but I'm also turning to the Barış because he has some questions, I guess. Leave the stage to the Barış.
I just wanted to ask to Luigi very quickly if he thinks that this inaction in the European Union is something that is a permanent characteristic of the EU, or is it something, in Luigi's view, that the European Union can learn how to overcome, and over time perhaps be more, be an actor that is more active. But again, I think it's a little bit tricky to to decide what's activity and what's inactivity. But what would Luigi think about it? And I'd like to ask the same question to Ahmet as well, actually. Does he think that, inconsistency is something inevitable in the European Union, or does he think that it is possible to overcome that? And just to add something also about Ahmet's paper, or what he said just now, are you interested in interviewing Ahmet? Just out of curiosity. So I'll be happy to hear your ideas about it. Thank you.
Shall I go first? I think it's a very useful question and something that I need to think about, of course, because the question actually leads to the issue of what should be the optimal reaction of the European Union. It invites a comparison with what the EU did in 2022 as opposed to what it did not in 2014. I think if there is a normative assumption that inaction is bad, I would disagree with that. So I would say that I wouldn't start with a normative assumption that inaction is bad, because sometimes inaction is the deliberate choice of the European Union. So it's Russia. It's better not to do anything rather than to waste resources, for example. On the other hand, yes, there are lessons to be learned. Possibly, there are lessons to be learned. Yeah. But that's something that I would need to think about. For example, to think about whether then one needs to explain the framework. So the choice of creating a legal framework where there is unanimity as opposed to qualified majority voting, which is what I looked at in my doctoral thesis, but what I do not look at in this book. It's a very, very helpful question. Thanks. Thank you. It's really very, very useful to open up these lines of inquiry, and I will spend a lot of time thinking about them. Thanks.
I totally agree. It's very helpful to discuss, especially for me, the theoretical framework chapter, because I have been drafting this chapter for maybe 6 months. And I have still doubts and questions, and this organization is very beneficial for me. And about your question, I think we can expect a certain degree of inconsistency for European Union's foreign policy, because in a pluralistic society like the European Union, it is normal to have different opinions, different views, different priorities. Sorry. And since there are multiple actors that can affect the foreign policy, I believe there will be a certain degree of inconsistency in the foreign policy decisions. However, then we should ask the limit of this. I mean, in foreign policy decisions, it is normal to expect some degree of inconsistency, but not in a very short time. I mean, I don't know exactly right now, but it's a hard question to answer. How the level or degree of the inconsistency should be in the European Union's foreign policy. And about the interviews, I have met with several parliament members because counter sanctions of China addressed the MEPs mostly, also the political and social committee of the parliament, and the parliament is the main, you can say, political actor that supports the values regarding the China case. And that's why I met with some parliament members. Also, I met with some commission senior officials that negotiate the CAI process, the comprehensive agreement. But I also want to speak with some think tanks as well as some journalists on this field, because maybe they can offer me a wider perspective or a bigger picture. But I can summarize it like this.
Is there any other question, Barış, you would like to share?
Just not a question, but quickly add, and I think Luigi wants to jump in as well, but just one thing about, and I think Ahmet, is a very good idea to diversify the interview sources, go beyond policymakers and also include maybe like analysts and journalists, etc. And I think, you know, in my paper, I found out that, you know, inconsistency is something very, very frequently occurring in the European Union's foreign policy. And basically because, well, I think one of the reasons, my main reasons, is because there are too many conflicting demands that the European Union wants to address. You know, you can't just say, I'm going to help European economies while at the same time trying to save the planet. And to address these conflicting demands by member states and by civil society, etc., the European Union finds itself giving conflicting messages. The question is whether this is fine or not, whether the European Union actually aspires to be a consistent actor. And what this then makes me think is, you know, sometimes there is no coherence in the European Union's messages. Sometimes the Commission says one thing, sometimes the Parliament says one thing, the Council says another thing. And I think Ahmet also, you know, referred to this in his framework. And then perhaps a further food for thought is whether inconsistency is something that is useful for the European Union, because by being inconsistent, it actually is able to reply to conflicting demands. And then, but what does it say for the European Union's coherence? For us, for researchers, for analysts, coherence is important because, you know, we look at the coherence of actors. They need to be coherent in order to be successful sometimes. But is that really the case for the European Union? Why do we care about coherence as well? I know this is beyond the scope of perhaps Ahmet's paper, and maybe you know, that can be something as a further food for thought. Just not necessarily a question, but again, just wanted to add these quick remarks.
Yeah, and if I may build on that, there might be, is there not inconsistency between the values of the European Union or between the objectives of the European Union per se? And I'm thinking about here about the stuff I'm familiar with, Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, which lists the values internally, Article 3, Paragraph 5, which lists the values of the external action, and Article 21, which lists the objectives or principles of the EU external action. Those are the values, objectives, and stuff that the European Union has to do. Some of them might be inconsistent. There simply is inconsistence between. There might be, okay, so in some cases you could say there is inconsistency as a matter of principle between sustainable growth, full employment, and having a social economy. That's possibly impossible. So it's a contradiction in terms. In other cases, there might be a contradiction in practice. So fostering European Union interests and security and independence might lead to I don't know, a restriction of trade in the case of restrictive measures, and the restriction of trade is against the objective of opening up trade liberalization of Article 21 to letter F. So perhaps there is some inconsistency built in into the very framework, really. And why do I say that? Just because from my literature, I mean legal literature, there are some contributions now that study the value, the normative value, kind of how binding these objectives or external values are. And if you want, I can send you the references in case you want to have a look at that.
Also, Barış, you mentioned your works on climate governance, and I would be grateful if you could share it. And yeah, Luigi, that's a very interesting comment. And I would like to discuss it wider also after the seminar. And I would love to read your comments on this. Thank you.
Is there any other questions coming from the audience or you? If it's not, I would like to ask one question to the Luigi about the case of the Ukraine. You always looking for the failure to act to the Ukraine, and may I ask that how did you find the actions of the member states in both cases regarding to the failure to act? You always mention about they are not acting in a coherent way, but somehow in Ukraine, when I compared with the Libya, I see some kind of actions. I mean, not the failure to actions, especially in terms of, the sanctions policy. They act together, and you always tell that it's because of the threat of Russia. I'm sorry, maybe I'm so destructive to ask that. How did you find the actions of the member states in two cases? Because you only mentioned about they are not acting, but I see some consistent and some actions under the name of the European Union, especially in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I have to clarify that for sure, because I agree with you. Member states do act as member states. So I think that the crucial difference is precisely that. If you're talking about France and Italy, in Libya, yes, they did act. Libya, March 2011. The member states, France and Germany, in Ukraine, they did act, but that is kind of the puzzle. Why was it France and Ukraine? Why was it France and Germany as opposed to being Federica Mogherini? If instead you're saying they act within the council, so there is EU action, that's more. That's more of a problem, because as a matter of fact, the EU did do something, and I think that perhaps a comparison in negative to what the EU did this time when it came to the invasion of February 2022 can give us an idea of what the EU could have done. Realistically, the European Union could have authorized the transfer of weapons already back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Now that might not be the case though, because the legal framework was not in place. So I have to look into that, but that is the kind of inaction. Yes, okay, or perhaps it's just not the right case study, and they can focus only on Libya.
No. Thank you so much. I would like to ask also both to the inconsistency and the inaction stuff. Have you also ever considered about the complex relationships between the European Union, NATO, and the UN also, in order to, to make an action once they're talking about? Because you say the constraints of, I'm talking to Luigi and also asking to the Ahmet, you have also Luigi told about the constraints of coming from the another actor or the unintended consequences. But in the meantime, some kind of reciprocal dependencies. The European Union would like to act, but there are some, the bilateral, multilateral agreements with the UN and the NATO, or in some cases, they need to get together to act together. And have you ever considered in your papers and in your research to this, because of the action, inaction, and the consistent and inconsistent decisions? Because these are, in my opinion, also affect the actions of the European Union.
Ahmet, you go first.
Thank you, Luigi. Yeah, I agree that these institutions and organizations have particular impact on the European Union's decisions, and they act, the relations between the European Union and these organizations have influence on, not only in the case of China, but also I think in the Russia, because we cannot simply separate the European Union's members from maybe NATO alliances or the UN Security Council's decisions or General Assembly's decisions. That's, I think, an important factor, but that's a field that I haven't actually studied. That's why I think Luigi would give a better answer to this question.
No, but I agree, Filiz. I think that is the key, at least when it comes to inaction, possibly also when it comes to inconsistency. That in my chapter might be the case simply that the EU did not act because somebody else did. So it's not just that we can explain that why the EU did not act by looking at the fact that somebody else did and explaining why NATO intervened, why the UN Security Council authorized the use of force in Libya, but that the EU did not act precisely because. Now, the fact is that I think the EU failed to authorize a CSDP mission before the March 2011 authorization of the use of force in the Council, but that's just an example. In Ukraine 2013, 2014, for sure, the division of competence between NATO and the EU has explanatory value. Yeah. Thanks.
I mean, it would be also help, I guess. One thing, maybe I'm going to beyond your scope. Even I read two of your papers. I would like to ask again. Did you consider to also look after from for Ahmet's paper the Chinese perspective to European Union in terms of inconsistent act, and also for Luigi's from the Russia? I'm always referring to Russia. Sorry. Because you have also mentioned about the not to act from these countries' perspective. If you did you consider about give some the information what these countries think about this kind of European Union actions? How, for instance, I'm giving the example. Sorry. How, for instance, Russia behaved the European Union to act like they. Or how China, react or act or have that kind of relationship with the European Union to, to have inconsistency in the European Union decisions on China. I'm just bumping into the questions, guys. Sorry, but I'm curious about. Might be useful in your paper too. Just to give information.
And I think Luigi should start first now.
So I am working on precisely on that, on Russian perspective, it's impossible not to work on Russian perspective on European foreign policy, broadly understood, not just EU but also NATO, because it features so prominently in the Russian official rhetoric as a justification for the invasion of Ukraine, that it's definitely very important. I don't think that that Putin would qualify the EU's activity as inaction, or certainly not NATO activities as inaction. I think he would say that it was a constant provocation. But you know, I have on my desk here a beautiful book called Putin's Russia and the Falsification of History. It's written by a historian who studies the rhetoric of the Putin's regime since 2000, on how they perceive essentially European security and defense since 1945. So it's a very important theme. Though I didn't think of including it in the chapter on the 2014 deal.
I would like to, say sorry to interrupt, Ahmet, just because you have always talked about the European Unions. We are talking about European Union's action, but we need to also consider, I guess, how these other countries that the European Union has relationship in terms of crisis or the non-crisis and etc. I remember Venezuela, why they can they act like that, and what is the reaction and an action. That's why I'm asking too. I mean, Venezuela would do this, and that's why as a react, European Union do this. For the Ukraine, I remember Russia did not, I'm terribly sorry to use the term, did not care about the European Union institutions in 2014, and they always went to the member state, took care of the Germany, took care of the France, rather than taking into consideration the European Union. That's why the action or the inaction of the European Union would like that. In terms of China, what kind of the action of the China leads the European Union to have this kind of decision? I just bumped into the question. Sorry, I'm terribly sorry, Ahmet. It's going to the scope, but yeah.
Actually, I haven't recently examined in depth Chinese perspective, but for your previous question, I might say that the EU and China have a different set of priorities and values. And as I can see that for now, the trade relations is the main determinant of the relationship, but China is very skeptical of interference, for foreign interference to internal affairs because of reasons like human rights or any other reasons. And this probably was a reason of the inconsistency between the relations. I also want to mention the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because this also complicated even more the relationship between China and Russia. But I think I should examine more the Chinese perspective on this issue, because until now I only dealt with the one side of the relationship, not examined much the other side.
Thank you, Ahmet, for the explanation. Thank you for answering to my silly questions. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to thank you all. That was very helpful. And I am glad that we are that there are only two presentations, because it allowed us to discuss in depth of our research. I also would like to thank Barış His comments are very useful, especially on theory and how to use the concepts in my research. And I also would like to thank Emma and Luigi for this organization and for their comments.
I think there is no other questions as far as I see. The topic is already, I guess, in somehow the problematic once we are talking about the European Union foreign and security policy, especially in times of the crisis of ages, especially in the latest Ukraine situation, and also the rising power of the China and the Russia. We have been always talking and other things. And thanks for your great papers and great presentations. Personally, I enjoyed myself. I hope the audience and also enjoyed. And I'm also very thankful for Barış for insightful comments and remarks and also questions. I hope you enjoy this.